Hi everyone, welcome and good afternoon. We are about to start the session entitled Communicating Microplastics Risks, Balancing Sensation and Reflection. My name is Julie Becker. I'm a facilitator and a science engagement practitioner, and I will be your host for the next 75 minutes. So first, a little housekeeping. So in this session, we're going to alternate between presentations and some more active moments involving audience participation. It'd be nice to see some of your faces so the presenters don't feel alone. But don't force yourself. if you'd rather have your camera switched off, that's okay, it's up to you. As far as your microphone is concerned, please keep it muted unless you're speaking. And you can see that the presentation is being recorded. If you're experiencing any technical issue today, we have a Zoom host from the conference team. His name is Michael Ziegel, and you can get in touch via private message if you have any issue. He's also playing audience advocate, and he can stop the speakers or myself anytime if something went wrong and we didn't notice. You'll see that we also have Céline Cheerhart with us in the chat, who will be posting some links and tips. So that's enough technicalities. We're going to turn to contents. Now, let me share my screen. Here we go. So in 2019, SAPEA, which is the organization that's bringing this workshop to you, SAPEA meaning Science Advice for Policy by European Academies, being a consortium of European academies as part of the European Commission scientific advice mechanism. So SAPEA in 2019 published an evidence review report on risk from microplastics to human health. And this report stated that there was an absence of evidence of risk. So now, how do you communicate absence of evidence in a context of different audiences and different risks competing for attention? Not an easy job, as SAPEA would soon find out when its communication around the report sparked an academic debate and a correspondence exchange in the journal Environmental International, leading to the publication by SAPEA working group members and staff of a paper reflecting on this experience. What we'll be doing together today is interrogate the fine line between sensation and reflection when it comes to communicating risks. We'll examine the various criteria, principles, and practices that communicators and scientists should consider when communicating risk. In the session's first part, Professor Bart Koelmans and Dr. Leslie Henderson will be telling you more about that particular microplastics story, while in the second part, Dr. Toby Wardman and Professor Sabine Pal will look at the specific question of how to communicate when we have no evidence at all and how people respond to that kind of message. We'll have 2 moments where you'll be able to ask questions and take part in an activity, one after the first 2 speakers, and then a second one at the end of the workshop. If you'd like to relay ideas from this session on social media, you can use the conference hashtag, which is FSCC21, and also follow SAPEA News on Twitter that will be reporting some highlights. Before we dive into our case study, however, we'd like to get a glimpse of who sits in the audience. And this is also an opportunity to get you on board with the platform that we will be using today for our interactions. It's called AHA Slides, and it's an audience participation and polling tool, which we'll also be using for Q&As. And so to access the presentation, which I invite you to do now, you need to enter the link you can see right now at the top of my screen, or you can also scan the QR code. Céline is also dropping that link in the chat, and that can go into any browser. If you're on a computer right now and you have a smartphone at hand, I recommend that you use your phone to join. That way you'll be able to use your phone as a sort of answering device while you can still watch the presentations and the poll results here on Zoom. That said, it also works to navigate between two windows on the same device. So if you are entering the link now in the browser, and I can see many of you are doing that, you'll see that you're landing on the first question, which is very simple. We'd like to know what your job title is, as a way to see how our audience is positioned on the science communication spectrum. So I'm leaving a bit of time for you to join, and you can see here on Zoom via my screen share what the different answers are that are coming in. So I can see we have a communications officer, a communications manager, a professor of nanomaterials, an environmental psychologist, someone who's in between job, a coordinator for some postdocs. So keep them coming, and you can join AHA Slides anytime during this session. So now it's time to hear about that microplastics story. While we are still on AHA Slide, what I will do is move to the next slide. Don't worry if you didn't get to answer the warm-up what's your job title question, because what it will do is it will show you how Q&A will work. So let me do that. So you can see right now that we have a blank slide, and on your answering window interface, you can see that you're able to send some questions. Don't forget to hit submit when you send a question. And you can submit as many questions as you wish, either anonymously or with your name visible. We'll tackle questions for the next two presentations together after we've heard from both Bart and Leslie. So as you submit a question, please specify for which of them it's meant. I'll stop sharing my screen. Don't worry, we'll share the link again later if you've missed a AHA Slide trick. And without further delay, let me give the floor to our first speaker, who is Professor Bart Koelmans from the University of Wageningen in the Netherlands and chair of the SAPEA working group. He'll be delivering a presentation entitled Risks of Microplastics and the SAPEA Report. So Bart, let's see if you can share your screen and your presentation. Perfect. Maybe hit present so we can see it. Magnificent. You now have 8 minutes.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you for your kind introduction. So happy to explain a bit about the SAPEA report, and the part of that report was about the risks of microplastics. And then especially, my view, or a natural scientist's view, on how to communicate risk when that risk is uncertain. What was the place of the SAPEA report? Why was it written? Now, this may look like a very complex scheme. Let's start at the right-hand side upper corner, where the main thing you should look at is societal challenges, right? So we have these societal challenges. There are all kinds of things that people worry about and that policymakers may worry about. So at some point, your European Commission might ask for an advice. And then there is this group of chief scientific advisors that then consider this, and they could write a scoping paper. And in that paper, it would be about, should we dig into this further? Now, if so, at some point, then SAPEA comes in and they install a working group with chairs and experts, and they provide an evidence review report. So a literature summary, just as accurately as possible, writing down what we know, what we do not know, and what the certainties and uncertainties are. And then this evidence review report is checked, and there is feedback, stakeholder meetings, and then it informs a scientific opinion written by the group of chief scientific advisors. And this flows into policy making for the greater good of better legislation. So this is what we did. And what was the conclusion about risk from the SAPEA report? Well, that's here, and in blue you see this more heading type of headline type of text. But as you can see below that text, it's not about the details now. You see that there's more explanation. And of course, in the report itself, there is far, far, far more explanation and detail. So this is a typical headline type of text here in blue. And what does it actually say? It says that the best available evidence suggests that microplastic, nanoplastic do not pose a widespread risk to humans or the environment, except in small pockets. However, that evidence is limited, and the situation could change if pollution continues at the current rate. So in this wording, you may sense quite some disclaimers already. We do not know it exactly, but there is most likely not a widespread risk, but on some locations there could be risk, and in the future risk could be more serious. This was already mentioned by Julie, that there was a response to basically these headlines, that it could be taken as no risk in the media and also in the wider public, and that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So it could be a cause for confusion. Now, this will be dealt with later in later presentations today. I would like to take you into how, in a natural science perspective, risks are derived, and what is the nature of the uncertainty that we're talking about, that natural scientists sometimes want to communicate. This is a rather technical graph. Imagine that you are thinking about the risks of microplastic. Then you need to know how many are there, what are the concentrations in the environment, and you need to know what are the effects. So people simply measure that. And if they would all do that in the same way, you would not see these differences. So on the vertical axis here, it's the different sizes of the particles that people consider. And you see it's all different. So all the methods that people and research groups use are very different. So basically, this is comparing apples with oranges. It's not compatible. So that is already one cause of uncertainty in the data that we have. The second category is that in this graph, you see species, so organisms, for instance, aquatic organisms, and they experience effects, and each data point in this graph represents where, at which concentration they experience an effect. So the most sensitive species are at the left-hand side, concentrations are low, and less sensitive species are at the right-hand side in this graph. But you see these blue curves at both sides of the median, and that is an uncertainty interval. So a mathematical way to express the uncertainty, and this is how it's done. However, still these data points, they still suffer from the first problem I mentioned, the incompatibility of data. Now, I think the type of uncertainty that we are talking about here is not new for you. You know this from the weather forecast, for instance. If it's about yesterday, we know for sure. If it's about today, we know it quite well. If it's about the next week, everything becomes more uncertain. So that is but the uncertainty can be quantified. So we can put numbers on these uncertainties. So then after having that, we can do the actual risk assessment. And that is done and illustrated in this graph, because this is where we bring exposure and effect thresholds together. If exposure in the environment, so the concentrations, are higher than an effect threshold, then we would say there's risk. Now you look at a cumulative frequency distribution here of concentrations on locations, aquatic locations worldwide. So these are all surface waters. And please look at the blue curve. If you look at the so 50% of the locations worldwide, you would read it's about 0.2, right? So 50% of the locations, if you read from the horizontal axis, have a concentration of microplastics lower than 0.2 particles per liter. And then you can go higher and higher and higher. And at some point, the blue curve crosses this vertical orange line, and that's the effect threshold, right? So you see that there is only a very small number of locations that has a concentration higher than this threshold. And in fact, and you see that in the text at the right-hand side, it's 1.5% of the locations. So the risk characterization that we do here tells us that 1.5% of the reported concentrations would be at risk, and the exposure would be higher than the effect threshold. However, that data was uncertain. So if we take the lower bound of the confidence interval, that 1% suddenly would be 28%. So there's a small chance that it's 28, right? If we take the higher bound of the uncertainty interval, there would not be any risk anywhere on none of these locations. However, the number that we would communicate probably would be this 1.5%, and we would provide also this uncertainty interval. And then I would like to end with a rhetorical question, rhetorical because there will not be an answer now. And that question is, if you would be the one communicating this outcome, so imagine you communicate the certainty of the presence of risk at 1.5% of the locations worldwide for a broad audience. How would you do that? How would you describe that? And this is where I will stop. Back to you, Julie.
Thank you, Bart. And as Bart mentioned, we'll be tackling his rhetorical question later in an activity. So for now, let's hear from Dr. Leslie Henderson from Brunel University in the UK, also a member of the SAPEA working group, whose presentation is entitled Microplastics and the Media, Key Challenges in a Changing Landscape. Leslie, if you're ready, you have 8 minutes.
Thank you. So thanks for inviting me to do this. I mean, I should say, as a sociologist and social scientist interested in media, I think it was quite a new departure for someone like me to be on the SAPEA group, which was, typically very, very technical, full of natural scientists. And I think we can't really talk about risk without talking about media, and that's what I'm going to share some thoughts on today. So in terms of microplastics and media, I'm sure I don't need to explain to most of you science communicators, that often the values of media values, scientific values don't necessarily align, certainly don't align completely. We know that not every issue, not every environmental issue, every scientific issue makes it into media. There's certain reasons and factors about why particular issues are very, seem to seamlessly move in, and others become very marginalized. And I think plastic pollution is a very interesting kind of case study in terms of that. So just a couple of points really. We also know that audiences or users bring all of their knowledge, existing knowledge, thoughts, prejudices, misconceptions to particular topics. And I think it's important to mention that obviously with something like plastic pollution, we all already have a relationship with plastics. It doesn't need to be explained what plastics are or why they might be valuable. And as we shall see, it's quite interesting to see in terms of microplastics how this kind of mundane object, part of everyday life, was also the object of a kind of scare story. And just a final point, I guess, on this slide, we know that media can help legitimize certain viewpoints, that certain ways of being or thinking or worrying about things can become normalized in particular ways. This means that media is subject to a lot of lobbying from different organizations, not just charities and NGOs, but clearly industry as well, who have, kind of commercial commitments and interests in presenting particular viewpoints. And it's important, I think, just to have that sense of this very kind of fertile landscape, very changing landscape in which scientific information is communicated. So in terms of microplastics, these are sort of, from the last few years, fairly typical stories. As I say, telling science stories at the moment It's happening in a very rapidly moving environment, a very kind of saturated environment where there's lots of different issues kind of competing for attention, from early stories around microbeads and toxins to more kind of official elite reports which came out from government sources and so on, to some campaigns. And we see more and more of this, that media is not simply reporting but creating actual campaigns and presenting their own scientific messages, from Sky Ocean Rescue to this is a Banish the Plastic Bag campaign by the British tabloid the Daily Mail, which has long been a sort of climate emergency denier. So it's very interesting that they got on board this whole plastic pollution topic. And also films, we don't just see science communication taking place around plastics in news and documentary, but also in adventure movies and so on. I think these are quite interesting stories. This first one, microplastics discovered in every sample of seafood purchased at a food market, is fairly typical. So the focus in terms of risk is the kind of prevalence of microplastics and the ease with which we might also be ingesting them, presumably. And this story here, microplastics found in human stools for the first time, is interesting because it's a good exemplar of how fast moving things are. So this is a story which actually involved 8 participants. The study sample was just 8 people. These tiny particles were found in human stools, and it moved swiftly from a conference paper which was presented straight into the Guardian, seen as a kind of fairly elite broadsheet newspaper within the British media, with no problem at all. And I think that is also an issue and a particular dynamic that can produce special challenges. Also, in terms of media sort of shaping government policy, a nice example here is Blue Planet 2, which I'm guessing many people will have heard of. Blue Planet 2, David Attenborough's take on highlighting the problem of plastic pollution, was seen to be kind of termed as a real game changer. So people talk a lot about Blue Planet effect, and it's kind of moved into our discourse, public discourse, and also policy discourse. So shortly following this screening, Michael Gove, who was our Environment Secretary, is reportedly haunted, which is a very emotional word, haunted as a policymaker by plastic pollution, having witnessed this in this documentary series. But actually, when you look at what's happened in terms of peer-reviewed evidence, certainly plastic pollution was helped maybe move into the public domain through Blue Planet 2, but it didn't actually have any kind of sustainable effect on people's behaviour. So it was in the discourse, but people said that they might be more likely to take part in a sort of beach clean, but in terms of actually sustained shifts in behaviours and so on, it didn't happen. So we often talk about media effects without them really being substantiated. So more recent framings of microplastic risk, and this is just a little search I did this week. We can see microplastics are seen to be polluting agricultural soils, to be a big threat to California oceans, and most recently, yoga pants, so fibers, are actually spewing microplastics into the atmosphere. So there's quite a lot to be concerned about there. And this story here around infant feeding, having in the past done some research around infant feeding, breastfeeding and bottle feeding, there are a few topics which are more sort of highly sensitized, I think, than how infants are fed. So this combination of feeding plus this idea of swallowing millions of microplastics a day is a very, very emotional story. And this is a much more recent one, microplastics revealed in the placentas of unborn babies. And we can see with all of these stories, the risks, they seem obvious perhaps to public, but within the actual piece, there's very little there in terms of evidence. But we have quite an emotional quote here: babies are being born pre-polluted. That's got a lot of resonance to it. And again, as with many of these studies, the study was very small, but it's very worrying. So, we might ask, and I think Sabina will talk about this later, what are the public expected to do? How can they make sense of this level of information? Another point I wanted to make in terms of media representation is about the size of microplastics, and now we talk about nanoplastics. When you have something which is barely visible to the human eye, how does that actually impact on media reporting and coverage? And this is quite interesting in terms of, this is quite a famous little image which comes from a moving film of plankton ingesting microplastics, and it's been used quite a lot. And some of my marine biology friends would disagree with this, but I think the public find it quite difficult to maybe engage with an image like this, whereas obviously a charismatic mammal entangled in plastic waste, it tends to be a real kind of flagship image in terms of media representation of the plastic problem. And I think this really feeds into what has been described by Goodman and Max Boykoff and others as spectacular environmentalisms. In a very cluttered, very busy media environment, you have to do quite a lot to get media attention. I mean, I'm interested in your thoughts about this as scientists and also as communicators. And that might involve, you know, having these very high profile kind of green celebrities and so on. But it needs to make a kind of visual spectacle, and visual grammar is everything because of this intense competition for attention. And at the same time, it's worth mentioning a couple of overarching changes. There's been a real decline in the specialists, not just in medical correspondence, but also science and environmental correspondence, which we've seen happen across the UK and the rest of Europe. At the same time, there's been a huge rise in NGOs as newsmakers. So NGOs are producing news, analysing news, and with digital and social media have a very straight connection to public. You know, it's a very sort of seamless move to kind of publicise particular perspectives. And in terms of ethical dilemmas, I just wanted to mention this because I think one of the results of this very intense competition is that we do see perhaps more kind of emotional attention-grabbing campaigns such as this one. I don't know if you're familiar with this one, Sea Shepherd. So this image here is obviously of a turtle entangled in a plastic bag. The plastic you use once tortures the oceans forever. Now clearly, and I've spoken to other sort of specialists on turtles, there's no way that the bag would ever be entangled in that particular way, and it's clearly mocked up to look and to refer in the public's mind to, you know, torture, human torture, which we've seen in places like Guantanamo and so on. And again, here we can see this very, very neat phrase. It's used a lot, very familiar to people around plastics. In 2050, there will be more plastic in the oceans than fish in the sea. And this is really my final point, that this intense competition and the kind of media environment that we're in means that certain myths or certain phrases become very, very common. So I just wanted to finally make this point about media storytelling, which I think we can't argue that it creates really powerful engagement. It can really help generate awareness and so on. But it can also possibly reframe and also maybe marginalize very important issues. This reference here is to a paper that I did recently looking at public understandings in Nigeria. And you might know that quite often messages about microplastics and also plastics kind of invoke a particular narrative where there's definite blame to certain countries. And so, for example, there was quite a lot of messages about Nigeria being the sort of 9th top polluter in the world and so on. And we see quite a lot of messages like this. 90% of plastics in the ocean comes from just 10 rivers in Asia and Africa. And what I did following on from SAPEA was to work with colleagues such as Martin Wagner in terms of looking at some of these very pervasive messages around plastics and microplastics to really unpack what's actually accurate, where is it coming from. So this is not such a neat message. It's actually 85 to 95% of all plastics transported by rivers to the oceans comes from 10 rivers. But you know, it's a very kind of a neat strap line. And also there's more plastics and fish in the ocean by 2050 is used a lot. It's used a lot by policymakers. This is a very uncertain projection, both of plastics and also fish. So I think really what I've hoped to do is just highlight some of the dynamics around media and science messaging in terms of microplastics and plastic pollution. And as I say, I'll be very keen to hear your thoughts.
Thanks a lot, Leslie, and thank you to Bart as well for sharing the case study and offering some first intellectual tools to analyze it. It's now time to take some questions from the audience about both of your presentation. To do so, we're going to use the same tool as earlier. Let me share my screen. hold on. Yes, this one. So if you're joining now, what you need to do is pop this link here, ahaslides.com/yy2ia, or scan the QR code, and we're also posting the link in the chat. You can pop that into any browser and you'll be on the platform where we're doing audience interaction today. So we are on the Q&A slide. As you type in your question, don't forget to push submit at the bottom of your window, and also to say if your question is for Bart or for Leslie. So let's see if we already have some questions. There's one here. I want to see some more. So I will first actually ask one of my questions to Bart while the audience is thinking of more questions. So Bart, if something goes wrong in communicating uncertain scientific results with high societal implications, who's responsible in your opinion?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think we all play a role. So that is the first thing to realize. And yeah, my view on this is it's a shared responsibility. So a shared responsibility, for scientists, but also journalists, media, but also the public. So I think that scientists, they should not bring too much alarm. They should not exaggerate, but they also should not downplay the findings that they get. So in my view, scientists should just try to stick to the facts, the data, and put numbers to the uncertainties that they find. Within the media, I often, as a scientist, observe quite some variation. But yeah, I sometimes see a bit of a bias towards the more alarming message. And I think that's understandable, but it may not always be. So the dosing of this alarming nature is very, very important, I think. So there's also responsibility to not make that too big. And for the public, yeah, I think any citizen has a responsibility to also check multiple sources. Don't believe everything you read. Be critical. So the headlines are the headlines. The headlines is not the full story. So one should read more about the details to be well informed.
Thank you, Bart. So I'll take the question I can see now from the audience, and I'll give it to you, Leslie. There was a suggestion on Twitter that the communication around the SAPEA report should have taken a more alarmistic tone. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, honestly, I think there are enough alarmist stories around. I think that SAPEA, in terms of the communication, it needed to be measured and careful, and perhaps not as kind of exciting and as attention grabbing possibly, but more accurate. I think that's really important, because actually then once the message is out there, other things will happen with that message and you then can't control it. So I'm interested in why people would think it should have been more alarmist, because we know that being alarmist and shocking people and even disgusting people doesn't actually bring about sustained change. And I think you just have to tread a cautious line, to be honest.
Okay, another question to both of you. Would you see a closer interaction of art and science as a possible route forward to engage the public with a difficult scientific topic? Maybe Bart, you first.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So yeah, it's obvious that people relate more to art than most people would relate to difficult scientific topics often. So I think, yeah, I think it's a no-brainer to try to see how close you can get and raise awareness. On the other hand, you cannot really explain difficult scientific topics through art, right? So you still would need the explanation. You cannot replace it with something artistic, I would say.
Thank
you. Leslie, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, actually, and I completely agree that more interdisciplinary work is much needed in terms of translating the science in particular ways. And we know that artists do work quite often with scientists on particular issues. I mean, certainly in the research I've done, I found that people really struggled to understand how are microplastics created, for example, and things like that. And I think that kind of those problems with scientific literacy can really be addressed through art. Yeah.
Great, thanks. We'll take a final question for Bart because it's a nice transition for the exercise we'll do next. Don't leave AHA slides, you will be needing it very soon. So Bart, Mary Mulder is asking, there's always uncertainty. So why do you think it's not common to present ranges like in your presentation, 0.1 to 28? I don't see why scientists should share just one number.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think that scientists actually provide the full answer. So also the uncertainty. I think that's what they do. They provide the confidence interval. Maybe not always in the first thing they say, but in the underlying scientific paper and in the explanation to a journalist, I would mention that uncertainty. But my personal experience is that after that, the one side of the uncertainty intervals is getting a bit more attention. So for instance, we recently found out that people on average per week eat less than a grain of salt by weight on microplastics. But there was a wide confidence interval, and the upper limit was a credit card a year. So in the article that was published in Nature, actually, the credit card was mentioned, not the grain of salt. So we were not really happy with that, because that's not what we expressed or tried to explain to the journalists. So that's what we often see.
Thanks a lot. I think there's more questions coming. We'd like to move on to the exercise that we have planned, and we'll see at the end if there's time to return to some of these questions. So everyone in the audience, I need you to get onto AHA slides because we will be using it for polls in a minute. So type in ahaslides.com/YY2IA into any browser. So Bart, we are returning to your rhetorical question that you asked at the end of your presentation, and we're going to use it to do a practical exercise of expert elicitation. So can you briefly set the scene for us and explain the principle of this exercise?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So from what I presented, you may have noticed that the risk is there at 1.5% of the locations. However, that's very uncertain. So as you probably understand, any audience or individual would perceive or interpret this uncertainty in a different way. And in risk assessments, we sometimes ask experts to assess the uncertainty through wording, through adjectives. So imagine, and that's something we would like to ask you, imagine you are the experts, and that we now are going to ask you to provide your personal vote with respect to the reliability of the risk assessment that I presented. So some of you may be invited to explain their votes, and then there could be a second round, because after the explanations that some of you gave, the opinions may have changed. So this is the brief explanation, and such an expert elicitation is actually often used.
Great. And so what's the specific question that we are asking our audience then?
Yeah, so I can repeat it. So imagine you have a piece of science communication targeting a broad audience. What adjective would you use to communicate the certainty of the presence of risk at 1.5% of the locations worldwide? So there's risk with a certain uncertainty surrounding that outcome, and the 1.5%, there's also an uncertainty around that. So how certain would that be?
So you can see on AHA slides that you can start voting or picking, it's not really a vote, an adjective to reflect that risk. There's about 30 seconds left to do that. As soon as you have entered your answer, you can actually go back to Zoom because you will see the results as they arrive on my screen share. Ooh, we seem to have quite a divided audience, Bart. It's going to be great. Okay. Do you need a bit more time? I'll reopen it just for a few seconds because I'm not sure if everyone had the chance to pick an answer. A few more people who'd like to chip in. Yes, I can see some more votes. Okay, I will close this again if I find the way to do it. I won't. Okay, so it will be lasting for another 30 seconds, but we can go into the discussion now. So what we're going to do is we'd like to hear people who voted on the extremes, and then we'll hear someone from the middle. So Bart, where do you want to start?
Seeing this, I would like to start with either the likely or the very likely.
Okay, so would someone from the audience volunteer who picked either likely or very likely, and speak up now and explain very simply why you picked this adjective? Just go for it.
I picked likely. My name's Gareth Smith.
Hello.
I would say that's largely about if you say it's in the middle, then no one's going to pay any attention. So you need to convince people that there is an importance.
Okay.
And because I'm unsure about how important that is without having read the report fully, then I would pick likely as it stands now. If I knew more about it, then perhaps I would pick a different figure.
Great, thanks a lot. And I guess now we want to hear from the other end of the spectrum. So anyone who picked very unlikely, go for it. Explain. Don't be shy. There's 6 of you. We know it.
All right. I was one of the 6. Yeah, it just seems that there's a very low chance. So I would say it's unlikely. And to latch on to what the previous speaker said, if the chance is so unlikely, maybe it's not newsworthy.
Thanks.
But that would be my conclusion. That could be my conclusion.
Thanks. And now we'd like to hear from one of the 2 people who picked about as likely as not. What is your reason for that? One of you dare to speak up?
Okay, well, one of those was me. Hi, I'm Toby. My reasoning was that the 1.5 is kind of the middle of the confidence interval, that it goes in a decent direction in either way. And so if that's considered to be the average, then that seems to be, you should put it in the middle of the adjectives as well. Okay, great. So now that we have heard these views, what we're going to do is run the same poll again and see if anything has changed in the audience. So let me just write down the results so we know. Here we go. And we're running the same poll again. So here we go. You have 60 seconds to vote again. Has hearing these arguments shifted your view or not? So pick an adjective again. We had 13 votes earlier, so it'd be good if at least 6 more people voted so we could compare. A few more seconds to do that. Okay. Last few seconds to vote. Go, go, go. Okay, so we only had 11 people answering this time. Last time we had 6 very unlikely, and now it's moved to 3.
we had 3 unlikely, which has now moved to 4. There's only 1 person left in about as likely as not, whereas before it was 1. We have 1 likely like before, and 2 very unlikely, whereas we had only 1 before. Bart, what do you make of these results?
I think it's very interesting. I would like to make 3 points. First of all, there is no right or wrong answer, right? This is a voting. This is about personal opinions, looking at the evidence as it is. Another thing to note is the wide range of the votes. And this is actually what you always see. So you might think if it's with experts on microplastics, people that know everything about all the technical details, you also see a similar range. And then the third thing I would like to mention is that in the second round, it seemed as if the extremes, it flattened a bit. Now, of course, I cannot explain that because I do not know why you changed your opinions. So if I would speculate on it, then I would say maybe Toby was convincing because he was more in the middle and he explained why. Well, 1.5 is in the middle. So I could speculate about some of you maybe reconsidering a bit and yeah, leaving the extreme position. Last comment. So if this was done for policy advice, we would simply present this. The first round, the second round, we would calculate an average and also the range so that it would be available for a policymaker, yeah, to inform on decisions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. It's time now to move to the second part of the session. We're going to hear 2 presentations, and what I'm doing here on AHA slide is I'm opening. So sorry, we can go back to this later if we have the time. This is actually the recommendation of the IPCC as to how to use certain adjectives when you have a percentage of likelihood. We can come back to this at the end. So I'm opening the Q&A again on AHA slide, so you can put in any question as they come from you. I'll stop sharing my screen so that our next speaker can do his screen share. Dr. Toby Wardman, Head of Communication at SAPEA, is going to tell us about the meaning and ethics of zero evidence. Toby, we are all ears.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so we've been talking so far mostly about the practicalities of communicating uncertain risk. So it's my happy duty now to divert the conversation in a bit more of a theoretical direction. I want to raise the specific question of what to do in a situation where you have not just wide uncertainty, but actually no evidence or next to no evidence or no good evidence. And when I say what to do, I really mean 2 different things. Firstly, what does zero evidence allow us to conclude? What should we think when we have no evidence? And then secondly, what should we communicate about that? And I want to point out that these are 2 different questions. Even though they look kind of similar, they're very different. The first one is about like logical reasoning. What does it mean when we have no evidence? And the second one is about ethics. What is the right thing to do? What should we do when we have no evidence and when we communicate about that? So I want to quickly give some thoughts about each question in turn. So in case you're bored of hearing about microplastics by now, here's a toy example about rabbits in boxes. So here's 10 boxes and maybe there are rabbits in them. So let's find out. Okay, first experiment, we open a box. No rabbits. So to be clear, we have zero evidence so far that boxes contain rabbits, right? We open one box and suddenly no rabbit. What can we conclude from that? Have we proven the hypothesis? No, obviously not, no rabbit. Have we disproven the hypothesis? Well, no rabbit yet, but then we only opened one box. Maybe the next box will have a rabbit. And then thirdly, has our estimate of the likelihood changed? So this is a sticky one because the answer mathematically is yes. We did one experiment and we got a null result, and a null result tends to disconfirm the hypothesis. There's kind of math behind this, but I'll try and gloss it without going into the maths, without going down that rabbit hole. Whatever we thought the likelihood was before of boxes containing rabbits, and that's important, we now have reason to think to revise that estimate a little bit downwards, because now we know a little bit more about the world. We know that at least one box, this one box here, does not contain a rabbit. We don't know a lot, but we know that. And we should take that little bit of knowledge into account when we talk about what we know so far. I guess if you don't find that quite convincing yet, don't worry, we'll plow on and see what you think later. Okay, so what about now? 5 experiments done. Have we proven the hypothesis? No, still no rabbits. Have we disproven it? No, still some more boxes to check. Has our estimate of the likelihood changed? Yes, like for the same reason as before, only better. We've now checked 5 boxes. That's half the boxes we have, and they're all empty. So the question will start to come to mind, if there are rabbits in boxes, why haven't we found any yet? Now, one answer could be, well, we're just unlucky. Okay, that's weird, but fair enough. Another answer could be, well, maybe rabbits are rare, and so if you just do 5 experiments, you might not find one yet. Or a third answer could be, well, actually, there's no rabbits. But certainly, whichever way we go, the theory that we have rabbits is looking at least a bit shakier than it did, because at the start we had 10 possible ways that could be true, and now we only have 5 left. All right. How about now? Is the hypothesis proven? Clearly not. Is it disproven, or has our estimate changed? Okay, now we have to be a bit careful here. We've opened 10 boxes, we found no rabbits. Is this all the boxes in the world? Have we looked everywhere we possibly can look? And also, I guess, how confident are we that our experiments were reliable? If we're confident about that, and we think, yes, these are all the boxes in the world, then okay, yes, we've disproven the hypothesis. If not, we have some more work to do. I mean, this is obviously like a toy example, and I'm just using it to kind of build up the theory that usually in real life science, there aren't just 10 boxes and 10 experiments and that's it, right? There are many different ways to test the same theory, as Bart showed earlier on, and there are many kind of different variables to eliminate and so on and so on. But even so, whether or not we can say we've disproven it, there is one thing we definitely can say, which is that we've done a bunch of experiments and found no evidence to support the theory we started with. And that does not mean that we should still be neutral about it and pretend that nothing has changed since before we opened the first box. A lot has changed. We now have a bunch more evidence suggesting, if not proving, that the hypothesis is false. We have 10 experiments worth of evidence. And we have none suggesting it's true, despite having looked quite carefully. So that is a conclusion that's worth mentioning, even when it doesn't amount to proof. I'm gradually going to wend my way towards the point as it relates to microplastics here. But first, let me introduce you to a friend of mine. This is Bertrand Russell. This is, by the way, what he really looked like. If you don't believe me, you can Google him. This is the guy. He imagined a teapot orbiting the sun, right? He imagined it. He just made it up. And he basically said, okay, if you wheel out your best telescopes and you look and you look and you look, you scour the skies for months or years on end and you don't find the teapot, okay, maybe you haven't proven there is no teapot because maybe you just missed it, but you'd also be insane if you thought that you had no idea at all whether there was a teapot or not. You have a whole load of evidence now, and you have evidence for the theory that there is no teapot. Not proof, but evidence. Okay, so what? This is a stupid phrase. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It's often repeated like it's true, including by people who ought to know better, naming no names, but we can call bullshit. Absence of evidence is evidence of absence. It might be strong or weak evidence, depending on how good your science has been, and also like how plausible your theory was in the first place. What we can say instead of that is that absence of evidence is not proof of absence, or unless you meet these particular criteria, which in the real world you very rarely do. All right then, so what do we say then about this hypothesis? If I understand Bart and his fellow experts well, one thing is for sure, there's a lot of work still to do. I don't know how many of these boxes Bart would say we've opened so far, but my understanding is like not all of them by any means. And so far, by and large, with most boxes, in most cases, we've got no good reason to think microplastics are harmful to human health at their current level, blah, 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 with all the provisos that we've talked about. That is, the boxes we've opened so far have mostly been empty or appeared to be empty as far as we can tell. But we know that finding empty boxes is evidence. The more experiments you've done that could have demonstrated harm, or the threshold could have, where the level could have reached that threshold that we know is harmful, and it hasn't, the more evidence we have then that the theory, the hypothesis, is false. So what should we say? This is now the ethical question. Like, how do we communicate? How should we communicate the fact that we've not found good evidence yet? There are lots of options here. Here are a few of them. And I don't want to give like a simple answer, because actually it depends on a lot of factors, and that means it'll vary from case to case. But I just want to point out something about those factors. It's not just about finding the right words to express what we know. That's important, and it's what we were talking about so far. But it's also about figuring out what we want to say, what is like the ethically best option about what to communicate. Because pretty much all those options I just showed you on the screen are defensible given the evidence. The question is which one is the right thing to say. And we have to choose this very carefully, because science communication can influence public behavior. Making the wrong choice when we communicate can be counterproductive or even dangerous, even when what you say is, quote, strictly factually correct, unquote. So I guess we need an expert in human behavior to advise on that, how that might work. Okay, thanks for your attention.
Wonderful transition. I think that expert is just around the corner in the form of Sabine Pahl from the University of Vienna, Austria. She's the vice chair of the SAPEA working group. So Sabine, let's have your screen share. You're going to take us into behavioral and social sciences and share what we know, but the way people respond to different kinds of messages. And your presentation is called Psychological Perspectives on Microplastic Risk. The floor is yours. Oh, Sabine, you might need to unmute yourself. It's going to take 1 second. Of course, it worked perfectly when we tested it earlier.
Sorry, my screen was just doing some very strange things. I hope you can hear me now.
We can hear you. It'd be great if you can go into full screen. Wonderful. We're all set.
Okay, great. Thank you. I very much enjoyed the discussion so far and all the different perspectives. So I'm coming back to the risk in society idea. I want to talk a little bit more about the context and about the psychological perspective. So I want to start with some data about concern. So there is considerable data now that people are concerned about plastic pollution in general. And I wanted to show you a recent study we've literally just published, which asks about human health concerns. So not just general, does it harm animals and so on, but more about human health. And this is a large study we did in the context of the European SOPHIE project, Seas, Oceans and Public Health in Europe, where we asked more than 15,000 people in Europe, plus an Australian sample, what were they concerned about? And this was in the context of marine threats. So marine threats includes very practical things like flooding, like jellyfish, like sunburn. So a whole range of different issues. And what I want to show you here is the top concern amongst almost all of the countries was plastic pollution. So not just plastic pollution in general, plastic pollution causing harm to human health. The second concern was chemical or oil pollution, and it was only 2 countries where this was reversed. So I'm showing you this to paint the picture, to show you the context, that actually people are extremely concerned about plastic pollution for human health. And that flies in the face of a lot of the research we've reviewed so far. It flies in the face of the SAPEA report. And it's really a big question mark why people are so concerned. We've seen Leslie's talk earlier where she said, you know, the media play a role, we have all these stories, and that's probably where this comes from. But it's quite specific for plastic. And going in a bit deeper, we wondered the same question, how do these concerns, these perceptions come about? And I just want to refer to one study that we ran a few years ago where we showed people plastic that was in cosmetics. So there was a scientific study that extracted plastic particles, microplastics, from a range of cosmetic products, and we showed these to people, and then we just recorded their responses, and they were generally shocked. They said it's quite dangerous across the different groups we asked. And then the last thing that I've highlighted here with the red box makes a bit of a link. So people started to make the connection between microplastics going down the drain, going to the waterways, maybe ending up in the ocean. And they said, that's the beginning of the food chain. So if the fish eat it and then I eat the fish, it will affect me. So these are questions that explain the mental models of people's concerns. How do they think they might get affected? And there are plenty of other examples. Leslie mentioned the baby bottles earlier, for example. And this is the sort of thing that we're interested in. And we've just started a collaboration with the European Food Standards Authority, where we're doing a mental model study that follows up these ideas about microplastics in food. So that's the background, that's the context where we are. And in this context, we then did the SAPEA report. I've just summarized the main conclusion here. You've seen this before. I don't need to explain this a lot. But for me as a psychologist, it was really interesting that we had these responses that Leslie and the Pledge wrote a fairly strong commentary and said, where's the evidence that human exposure to microplastics is safe? So they turned it on its head and they put it in the context of the precautionary principle that says we should protect people, we should do things even if we don't have full knowledge. So the question to me is, where's the right threshold? How much evidence do we need? What sort of evidence do we need to make the right response? That to me is a really important question that I'm trying to understand, and we're working on in the group at the moment. I also have to say, we work well with Heather, Leslie, and Mike the Pledge. They're friends, they're collaborators. It's not the case that we're all enemies, we don't talk to each other. So I want to say a little bit more about this discussion, this debate, and then come back to some psychological factors. So one thing we pointed out was in their criticism of our work, they also made quite a few assumptions. For example, a statement of absence of evidence of risk can be all too easily perceived as a statement of no risk, or many mainstream media have picked up the no risk soundbite. These are assumptions. We have no evidence for this. And it relates to what Mike Schaefer said earlier. We need to have more evidence of how communications are perceived, what the risk, what the effect is of these communications. So we need evidence. We need to apply the scientific method on these sorts of messages. And that's from communication, from psychology, from social science. Given that we didn't analyze the response to this report, we looked to the science communication that exists already. And there are a few things we pointed out. There's negativity bias. Information dominates human information processing, particularly if it's negative. So bad news, scary things. It draws more attention. It's more memorable. Those are the psychological processes if compared to neutral or positive information. So knowing that, we know that these negative pieces of information will be overrepresented and shared more. That's one warning to how we deal with this. We also know about motivated reasoning and confirmation bias. So there's a human tendency, a natural tendency to seek confirmation of their pre-existing beliefs and expectations. And I've just shown you what the public already thinks. So what do we learn from this? What should we do? And I think this is also to be discussed. Perhaps we should exert caution in context where there's already an expectation of risk. So particularly in those, if this is not new, it's not an emerging risk, but people already expect it. Perhaps we should be extra cautious about these messages. We know transparent and honest communication is really important. It maintains trust in science, and part of this is communicating uncertainty and lack of evidence, as Nicole pointed out earlier. There are some concerns in the scientific community. There is some previous work that shows if you communicate uncertainty as an expert, it may lower trust because people think, well, you don't really know what you're talking about. And perhaps that's lack of competence. But reality is complex. Sometimes we don't know the answer. And more recent research has shown we don't need to be so worried about this. The decrease in trust is small. And it depends a bit on what sort of communications you're using. For example, it's observed for verbal expressions of uncertainty, such as in the exercise earlier, not so much for numerical. So these are things to consider. And this was one specific example of science communication in the particular context of plastic. I've shown you a bit about the context, but I want to step back again for a moment and think a bit about what determines action. Because I think in the field, a lot of us, not everyone, but we're interested in action and in the question, when should we do things? When should policymakers step in and do things? And I want to remind you of a model from psychology that tells you about the factors that determine action. So from perception now, I'm asking what determines decisions and actions or behaviors. And this is a summary from social and behavioral science literature, from psychology, that says if there are behavioral options, you can make a decision, you can make, you're free to decide what to do. And that's determined by a lot of different things. I won't go through each one of them. Concern is certainly part of it. So we've seen this high concern. People want to know what's happening. They want to know about their own action. They also say to the policymakers, please do something about this. But this is also influenced by other attitudes about the political landscape. It's influenced by identity. So am I someone who's always worried about environmental concerns? It's influenced by values, really important aspects. So all of these things, social norms, what do other people think? What do other people do? And knowledge and information or evidence, however you name it, is only one small factor here. And that's something we need to keep in mind. And this doesn't just apply to the general public, to individual decisions. It also applies to policymakers. It also applies to scientists. We've discussed this a bit. Scientists vary as well. And there's also this emotional aspect where Leslie mentioned this earlier a little bit about fear appeals, for example. Sometimes when I talk to NGOs, they say, yeah, but we need to make people scarce, otherwise nothing will happen. And we know from the communication literature that sometimes that's too overwhelming. People just close down and they say, I don't want to know about this. Maybe a bit like Corona. And they need to have a way forward. So I just wanted to remind you that that's in the bigger context. And then I've probably nearly run out of time, but the other thing I wanted to show you is again about change, but from a slightly different perspective. I know many of you will know this, the social amplification of risk framework, where you have risks and risk events in society, and there's all these different things that determine what happens at the end. There's sources of information, and I've sort of put the SAPEA report in here. I'm not quite sure where it fits, because I think in reality, very, very few people will read it, however sad that is. You've got information channels, and professional information brokers are a really important part of this. You've got social stations that may repeat messages, that may change messages, that may interpret messages for you. Really important. Again, news and media down here, all of these organizations, voluntary, government, they will have people who communicate often in a professional way. And then we have the individual stations, that's sort of the psychology approach, what happens at an individual cognitive, emotional level. And you have responses as a consequence from social protests. You know, are people out in the streets protesting about plastic? Not yet, but we have seen very strong responses. We've got political and social action. So if we're unpacking this whole process, there's a lot going on. We need to know about this, and we need to know how to deal with this. I think I'll stop there just with a few key messages. There's a high level of concern. I've shown you one example there. And just coming back to that issue, that risk is a societal issue. There's a technical risk assessment that Bart, for example, talked about, but that's not the only thing. It matters what the meaning is of this risk. Does it conflict with values we hold dear? Does it play with our emotions? How is it related to trust? Do we trust the person who's told us this? Again, Nicole Corbett made this very powerful point, and it's beyond the mere facts. We can't assume that it's just about the information and giving the right detailed information. And communication efforts must try to find line between raising these concerns and not being too alarmist in the context of lots of different things, different audiences, different risks competing for attention. Again, Corona springs to mind, where policymakers and decision makers and the public are all asking for actionable, meaningful information. They want to know what to do, and where communication success may mean something else to different people. And it particularly struck me earlier, one person in the audience said, but is it newsworthy or not? And I'd really like to have a discussion about what's newsworthy or not, because there are these different indicators of what we should be sharing, what we should be talking about. Yeah, that's me done. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Sabine. We have a bit of time for some Q&A, and we also have a question for you, dear audience. So we are back onto AHA slide, and some questions have come up. Just 1 second. Here we go. So Toby, there's a question that I think is for you. Someone is asking, could we relate all this to Goodhart's law? When a measure becomes a target, it stops being a good measure?
Sorry, could you say the question again? Also, I think you're sharing the wrong bit of your screen, perhaps.
Oh dear, yes, I am. You can see my script right now. Thank you very much. So while I share the right fraction of my screen, the question is whether you find that there might be a link between what you've explained and Goodhart's law, which is when a measure becomes a target, it stops being a good measure.
I'm not sure I completely understand what the question is asking. I'm sorry. Perhaps the person who asked that question could pop up and say it verbally. I'd be happy to have a go.
Hello, it was me who asked the question.
Hi.
You can hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Yeah, this Goodhart's law is, famous in economics, I guess, but it's also something that's been shown to us as a guide during scientific practice. So your boxes reminded me of that. Maybe we should also emphasize that it's important how to design the first question, like what should the question be so that we have a good measure in the end. If you ask the question in a different way, your measure might mean something different.
I see. I see. So the theory of when a measure becomes a target, it stops being a good measure, presumably is saying when we're aiming for it, then we're influencing the experiment in a way that means it no longer becomes a useful bit of feedback.
Yeah, when you start opening boxes, if your only measure is just opening a box, then maybe this is not answering what you're trying to find out, and you're not even aware of it, kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm sure that's the case. And I think with in the case of looking for evidence of risk for microplastics, for instance, I think as Bart showed in his presentation, there are a wide range of different ways you can measure it. And I think it's important that there are all those different kinds of experiments happen. You can kind of triangulate the outcome based on all the different experiments that have been done.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks. There's a question for you, Sabine, or a comment on newsworthy. Isn't it defined by what sells best? And the person who dropped this comment said, how do we overcome this challenge then and make newsworthy what really is?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. I mean, there's even some evidence that says fake news are shared more and shared more quickly than true or veridical news. I'm not sure I can answer this question. I would really like to hear from some practitioners about perhaps how do you make the decisions here and what are the pressures you're under if you publish a scientifically absolutely correct news article or communication, and it doesn't get shared a lot, and the feedback is, oh, this is boring, there's nothing really to learn. I mean, does that then prevent you from doing this? So I don't think I've got the answer. I think this is a really core question that we need to understand and maybe do something about.
Wonderful. So I suggest that actually you discuss that in the coffee corner of the conference platform afterwards, because there is such a thing. And I have 1 minute left to show you the question we wanted to ask you, audience. And it is, what did you hear today that might change how you approach your work in the future? And please drop your answers via AHA Slides. Or if someone wanted to just share a comment here in Zoom, you're also welcome to. We'd like to know if you got anything that's good for your practice from this session, any learnings. I guess people are typing right now. So someone said absence of evidence is evidence of absence, not proof. And someone saying, I'm going to add plenty of microplastics. I won't use the phrase absence of evidence. I can see some of our speakers are smiling at this comment. So what I suggest, we will, write more about the lack of evidence. Wonderful. So the conference organizers have asked me to finish well on time, and it's now well on time. So what I suggest is that we will tell everyone who'd like to leave now, and those who want to type their thoughts, don't hesitate to stay for 1 or 2 more minutes so that you can share your thoughts with us. I can see one more comment here. I realize it's important what you choose to make widespread, the types of images, for instance. And while people are typing, there was a question that I think was for you, Bart, concerning what we tried to do when we tagged adjectives. Well, when we tried to translate risk into adjectives. Someone remarked that maybe there should be 2 different headlines, one for locations that are more at risk and one for locations that are less at risk. Do you want to offer a thought on that?
Yeah, so that would actually be nuancing the message. Yeah? So the challenge is that something which is subtle and has a lot of detail needs to be captured in a short phrase. And I think that is often where one of the reasons why it could go a little bit wrong. So if you indeed would break it up into different messages for different subcases of the whole storyline, that could give you more detail, and that would make the report more accurate.
Great, thank you. So in the takeaway thoughts, someone wrote that we are gatekeepers and we should reflect science in what we communicate or let pass on through. Someone is mentioning the rabbit in the box analogy, and the ethics of science communication, mentioned someone, isn't something I'd ever thought would be controversial. Well, I hope we have proven you wrong in a way, because it's such an interesting topic. Someone else asked if I could show the poll again that we ran with the adjectives. So I'm going to go backwards to show it again. I guess this is what you wanted to see, Christina, and all these adjectives. And maybe I'll also show you. So this is the recommendation from the IPCC as to what adjective to tag onto the likelihood of an occurrence of a risk. And you can see, for instance, that for likely, it's anything above 66%, but as likely as not, it's quite wide. It's from 33 to 66%. So I think we will leave you with this. I hope you've enjoyed this session as much as we have. Don't hesitate to go to the coffee corner, and maybe I'll share a last tip of advice with you. And this is how to leave a Zoom call with grace. So first you need to stop sharing your screen. Then you need to, with your mouse, hover over the leave button with one hand, and then you can start waving and smiling with the other hand. And as you do that, press leave. That way you exit very stylishly. Thank you very much, everyone.